welcome to Storytime Friday. This is the story of how I moved to Malaga, Spain in 2007 with the hopes of becoming a professional cyclist. Now, this episode is a little bit different because it's not an interview and it's not a 5-minute Friday, but it's an interesting adventure, pre-digital nomad times, a pre-4-hour work week book even. So this is back in 2007, and my dream was to become a pro cyclist. And I moved to southern Spain, to Malaga, which is on the Costa del Sol, under the recommendation of several pro cyclists that I knew, one of whom lived in a town called Frigiliana, which is not too far from Malaga. And he said, it's the best training for the winter. You can train there for several months in the mountains or along the coast, and then come back to the US for the season and get a bunch of good results and maybe get a pro contract. So that was my goal. And I went there from January through April. So I guess 4 months I was in southern Spain. And I'll tell you some of the stories of what it was like to live there. And this was before I was trying to have a location independent business. So I had saved my money from my first job. Again, I'm a young kid at this point. That's more than a decade ago. We're recording this in 2018. So 11 years ago, almost 12. And I had, $8,000 in savings. And that was going to take me through the 4 months that I was there. And of course, things might be more expensive now, but I was able to live pretty cheaply. And so I'll start with the story of how I found my 120 euro a month room in a shared house. So I arrived with one duffel bag and one bicycle box. That was the luggage that I flew there with. And part of the reason why I chose Spain was that my girlfriend was already in Spain. She was going there with her family for New Year's. And I thought, oh, perfect. I'll get to see her when I move to this new country. Because I was sort of thinking, I want to go somewhere warm where I can practice my Spanish and train on my bike. So I was considering Venezuela and the Caribbean, Colombia, and it turned out Spain was an amazing choice. And when I arrived, I met up with my girlfriend at the time, met up with her at a hostel, because this was back in the day before you could really search housing, and there wasn't TripAdvisor online. So a lot of this stuff, you still had to, finding houses and finding fun stuff to do, you still relied on hostels and personal connections. So I'm glad I started traveling in the pre-internet era, because it teaches you the skills of asking locals what you should be doing, because they have way different insights even than an online forum like TripAdvisor. So I talked around at the hostel and they recommended a couple neighborhoods. And the neighborhood where I ended up living is called El Palo, which is just to the east of Malaga Center. And Malaga it's not a giant city, but it's big enough, very cosmopolitan, great shopping district. But it's very quick to get out of the city into the countryside, which is great for cycling training. So I found some ads. I think I actually found an ad on a bus stop or some sort of public forum where there's this number, and I can't even remember the name of the landlord, but it said, call this number. Marco was his name. And I was not in practice of Spanish, so I was hoping that someone would speak English, and he did speak a little bit of English. Turns out he was a Spanish teacher, which was great. He kept encouraging me to speak more Spanish, and I very slowly accepted his challenge. But he had this house with 20 rooms in it. It was this kind of weird mashup of a house. I think multiple properties smushed together, but a 3-story house with a big old courtyard. And around the courtyard were all these tiny little dorm rooms, essentially big enough for a bed, a desk, armoire, and my bicycle, which was sort of leaned up in between the bed and the armoire. So very small, probably, 8 by 10 or something. So a really small room that I was renting for $120 a month, 120 euros a month, essentially. So one of the first things that I actually did in Spain was to leave Spain and go to Morocco. And my girlfriend and I wanted to see Marrakech. We wanted to see Morocco. So we spent, 4 days there. And we took a bus down to the Strait of Gibraltar, where we took a ferry across. And then we took the Marrakech Express, which is an overnight train goes down along the coast to Casablanca and then in to Marrakech. We arrived at Marrakech at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. or something, and we spent the morning, it was kind of hazy that morning, walking around for hours with these French commandos. And these guys were crazy. They were the first people I ever met that did parkour. And they spoke a little French because they were French Canadian. And Moroccans speak a little bit of French. So they were able to use their French to find out. We were trying to find this one specific hotel, Hotel Medina, in the old city, in the old Medina. And we kept going to all these luxury places, and they had no idea where this little hole in the wall was, because it was literally a hole in the wall. You go down this alley, which is, about 3 feet wide, barely wide enough to walk down. And there's a little sort of a hobbit hole that you go down some steps into, and it opens into this beautiful ornate courtyard with tiles and fountains, and it's a several-story building with a shaft going up in the middle, and it's probably less than $10 a night. It was so amazing and beautiful. And the first thing that we did was sleep half of the day, because we took the overnight train, and the whole time I was afraid we were going to get robbed. There was constantly prostitutes coming in on the Marrakech Express on the train, and just random people. And this was my first time in an Arab country, and I was young and kind of scared to be riding this overnight train. And it was really just full of people wanting to have fun. And so my inexperience kept us from, one, having fun, and two, being able to rest at all on the train. So I was on super high alert, and when we finally found this hotel, it was great to just take a rest. And in the old town is the grand souk, which is a giant market. And when you think of Arabian markets with Aladdin's lamps and flying carpets and snake charmers, that was all in this market and more. And this trip to Marrakech was only 3 days, let's call it, maybe 2. And it was so full of amazing things. A random kid was following us, and he made friends with us, and it turns out he wanted to just have us over for dinner. So we ended up getting to visit his house for a family dinner and visit his mosque. I was able to go in to the male part of the mosque. So that was really amazing. And we spent all of our time in the market just looking at all the stuff that was there. It was so incredible. And I ended up buying a bunch of fossils taken from the Sahara Desert. And I ended up buying a handmade chess set from this guy who sort of had it was kind of like a lathe, but it was hand powered. He would hold part of it with his feet and move a bow that held a circular piece. And he was basically carving these chess pieces using a hand lathe and a hand drill. And he showed me a picture of him and President Ronald Reagan, and he had made a chess set and a wooden box for Ronald Reagan decades before. And so it was so cool to meet this guy, and I think I spent an hour watching him make this chess set. So we definitely bought a lot of souvenirs while we were there and took a lot of pictures, and it was really just a wonderful, pleasant experience. And those crazy Canadians, I saw them do parkour. We went out to dinner at this restaurant that overlooked the night market, the night souk. And this restaurant actually got bombed a couple of years later by terrorists. So pretty crazy when I saw the news and the photo of there's a glass bar behind where we were sitting, and just the picture of that whole thing exploding. You can see the photo of the explosion, and you can see the photo a couple of years before from our dinner there that night. It's kind of crazy to think that I was ever in a place that was hit by a terrorist bomb. And after dinner, these French commandos decided to run across the rooftops, go do parkour and run across the city. And this was after curfew. I guess in Marrakech or in all of Morocco, there was some sort of Muslim mandated curfew. So they went out at night, and I don't think they were arrested. I can't really remember. Again, more than a decade ago. But the way that they got up to the rooftops was basically bouncing back and forth up the walls of the narrow alley. And we just saw them sprinting off, jumping, leaping across buildings, running across the rooftops into the night. So incredible to see someone doing parkour for the first time. in the desert moonlight of Marrakech, Morocco. One of the things I regret is not buying a 400-year-old jewel-encrusted dagger from the tribes of the Sahara. We found our way into this museum, this collection of antiquities, and it was a dagger, very ornate dagger. It had pearls and jewels on it. I don't think it was that much. I think it was like $500, but it was more, obviously 4 months rent at the time. So I didn't buy it, but it would have been so amazing. And I think about that dagger and where it is today and wishing it was mine. It's funny, the things that stick with you, the regrets that you carry with you. And that's one of the few regrets that I have, I believe. So that was our trip to Morocco. And pretty soon after that, my girlfriend went back to the States. And I was left with several months of nothing to do but ride my bicycle. So after putting my bike together, you have to rebuild your bicycle after it gets boxed up for the airplane trip. The first thing that I did was get out a map, and I had a physical highway and road map. And then I also had the early Google Maps or even MapQuest back in the day that I was mapping out all the possible routes, because there wasn't anything like guidebook of cycling rides for people moving to Malaga, Spain to try to become pro cyclists. There was, as far as I could tell, nobody out there that could show me these things. So I didn't even know if there's going to be a local cycling community I could find. So my objectives were, 1, find amazing roads to ride on, and 2, find people to ride with, because 10,000 miles of training all on your own can get pretty boring. Although I still did most of the training on my own, and it was pretty cool, it turned out, in the end. And so the town of Malaga and the town of El Palo and Pedregalejo, which is where I was living, is right on the water, right on the coast. I was 1 block from the beach, and I would go to the beach and eat fresh fish caught just off the pier for dinner. And the mountains went right up behind the neighborhood. The town, the neighborhood was maybe 6 blocks wide, so very thin. And then as you go up into the mountains, you're basically in the countryside. So you could start training right from your house and start climbing right up the mountain. And the first little town up the mountain was about 30 minutes of climbing, so I don't know, 5-10 miles or something, called Olias. And from there, all the good routes sort of splintered off. And I would essentially do the same 3 beginnings of my rides each day. And for training, I worked up to somewhere between 4 and 6 hours of training per day, which maxed me out at about 600 kilometers or 400 miles per week at the peak of my training volume. And so the cycling training that I was doing then, I did so much training and so many hours that it basically has carried me through. It gave me the fitness that I've relied on for all the bike racing that I've done for the last 11 years. All in these 3 months was the foundation for basically the rest of my endurance sports career. So one of the things that I was doing is whenever I would see another cyclist, I would catch up to them or slow down for them or turn around and go talk to them and ask them, do you know if there's a group ride that I can find? Or do you know if there's somebody I can train with? And I must have met a dozen people before someone said, you want to join the group ride on Sunday mornings. And this was a ride of some top-level local professional cyclists and local triathletes and the sort of the elite amateur local cyclists. And one of the guys that I got to train with was a guy who had worn the leader's jersey of the Tour of Spain back in the 70s. And I knew this because he was actually wearing the jersey on the training rides. It was wool, it was yellow, it was the leader's jersey of the Tour of Spain from whatever year, 78 or something. And this guy, he was awesome. He probably weighed 100 pounds, was tiny. He went uphill so fast, and he was at that point in his 50s, I think. And even on cold days, because remember, it was winter, he wouldn't wear long sleeves or a jacket or anything. and it was raining and cold. And I said, "Oh my gosh, aren't you cold? I'm bundled up." And he said, "Your skin is waterproof. It insulates you from the weather. Like, you're fine. Essentially, suck it up, you modern wimpy kid." And it was on this group ride that I met my cycling mentor, Jeff. And he is a Canadian who owns a bike shop back in Canada. And he would spend time in Spain in the winter because Canada is even colder than the US in the winter. And so he'd been coming back to the same place every year because the cycling is so good there, and it still is amazing there. And he had this apartment, and he would come and spend several months just like I was. And so it was a perfect match. This guy who basically had an open schedule for training, and he had a lot of friends there, so he had more social activities than I did. But we started riding together pretty much every day, and he would show me different new routes and different towns. And he, I think, was a retired professional, so he would kind of coach me. He would say, "Here's what you need to eat after the ride," and he would push me. There was one particular downhill that was really steep with a sharp turn at the bottom, and I could ride it at about 40 miles an hour when I first met him, and he could ride it at about 45 miles an hour or 70 kilometers an hour, something like that. And so a gap would open up, and he said, "You need to be able to go at my speed. If you're going to be a pro cyclist, you need to be really good at going downhill and cornering, and you need to have balls, and you need to have skills and confidence." And so each time he would challenge me to brake later and later and less. And eventually I could ride this corner at the full 70 kilometers an hour. And it translated to, over the 3 months that I was there, this one particular descent with maybe 30 or 40 corners. And by the end of my time in Spain, I could go down the whole downhill without using my brakes at all. I could probably maintain about 50 miles an hour for this entire descent, because I knew it so well, and I knew my gear, and I had the confidence and the skills. And that paid off, and it helped me become a much better bike racer. And I could use my cornering skills to my advantage. And later when I was racing, I would even attack going into corners because I knew that I could hold a tighter line in corners and really rail the corner. And someone else was either going to have to go slower through the corner, or they just weren't going to be able to maintain their speed. So I would have a gap coming out of a corner. And that was all because of Jeff helping me do this one challenge over and over until I got better at this one skill of cornering at high speed. So probably the most epic single day of cycling that I did in Malaga was ride to see the finish of the Vuelta Andalucia, which is the Ruta del Sol. And this is a bike race that happens in February every year. It still happens. And it would be my first major European bike race that I would get to witness in person. The only problem was that it was 120 kilometers from my house, the finish line. So I had to ride there 120 kilometers and ride home 120 kilometers or something like that. It was going to be a really long day, and the weather that day was kind of crappy. In February, you never know. You might get a beautiful sunny day, and this day happened to be cold and rainy. So I knew I was going to be in for about 8 hours or more of cold, rainy riding over multiple mountain passes. And it was so tempting to turn around after a couple hours and not go see the race. But I said, "You're going to do it. And if you have to stay in this town, you'll figure it out." I probably had $20 or $30 with me. If I needed to find a place to stay and a warm shower and some food 4 hours from my home on the bike, I probably could have done it. But what happened was the way that I entered into the town, coming down off the mountain pass, was the same way that the race route went. And so as I was coming into town, all the fans were out waiting to watch the finish of the race, and they started cheering me. They started cheering me because they thought that I was the leader of the race. And they said, "Oh, look, el primero, the first guy." And they were all cheering, and I was waving to them. I was like, "Yeah, I'm not winning the race, but I love being cheered for." And so I rode along the race route all the way to the finish line and then just pulled off right before the finish line and sat there another half an hour before the actual pros came. And I think that stage was won by Oscar Freire, the Spanish rider who won multiple world championships. Pretty amazing. I saw a lot of my heroes. They were in that early season race. And that day I got the idea, because I passed by this cool geological feature called El Torcal, which is a bunch of rock formations and caves essentially on top of a butte. So a really odd looking place. You might think of them as hoodoos somewhere else in the American Southwest. But I ended up going back there with some of my friends from this group house. And we spent the day rock climbing, and then we went to my favorite town in southern Spain, which is Ronda, which is where the first bull ring, I believe, the first bullfight in Spain ever happened 600 years ago or something like that. And there's only one way into and out of this town, and it's across a massive bridge over a deep, deep canyon. The bridge is called the Puente Nuevo, and it's an easily defensible town because you can just seal off the bridge, and the town is on top of this pinnacle of rock. And we ended up eating at this restaurant on the side of the cliff overlooking the bridge and the valley. It was such an amazing experience. Ronda, super unique place if you ever get a chance to go there. So I was there with this intention of training so hard that I would become the best bike racer and I would get a pro contract at the end of that year, that I would get so much fitness that I would let my dreams come true. And so that meant that I was probably less social than I could have been. A lot of the other people that were living in the house, this shared house, were there teaching English, or they were there for some grad school or to learn Spanish or something, right? So they were spending a few months there. It was a bunch of young people, a lot of partying going on. We had a lot of parties in the courtyard just outside my room. And it was hard for me to focus on the cycling because there was so much social opportunity. And I found a balance that was mostly me being by myself. I would basically train all morning and then I would read a book in the afternoon. I probably read as much as I did cycle training. And that's a habit that's continued. It's shifted away from novels and nonfiction, away from novels and fiction. I do a lot more nonfiction reading now, but that might be where my post-collegiate reading addiction started. So it's great to pair endurance sports with reading. And I probably got through, 30 or 40 books in the months that I was there. But one of the social experiences that I really did enjoy was Carnival. And there's a town called Cadiz, which is on the west coast, southwest coast of Spain. And it's essentially on an isthmus, a peninsula of land going out into the Atlantic Ocean. And it's an old sort of fortress town. And all of Spain seems to descend on this town for Carnival. So, of course, we all got on a bus. We joined the local university students. And we spent probably 36 hours in Cadiz, and basically it was just walking around, drinking and partying in public with another 100,000 people for a day and a half. And we ended up spending the night in a tree. I think I slept in a tree. There was a lot of singing going on. I was dressed as a pirate, so it's a costume thing. And the singing. There's these groups of people that all show up in the same costume, and they have these chants and songs, and they stand on tables in the courtyard and sing. And it was probably the biggest party I've ever been. It felt a lot like, now that I've been to Oktoberfest, it felt a lot like that. Very festive costumes, a mix of Halloween and a birthday party. Really cool experience. Carnival in Cadiz. Another thing we would do a lot is cook dinners together as a house. We would all throw in a bunch of ingredients and sit around a big table in the courtyard and eat dinner together. And my contribution was often avocados, because on my cycling route, I would ride pretty much every day on my way home by an avocado orchard. And the trees overhung the fence into the road. And so I could just cycle along and pick almost ripe avocados hanging off into the road. So I would bring 3 or 4 avocados home every day, stuff them in my pocket, and they weren't quite ripe. So I had a cupboard full of unripe avocados, and they would slowly ripen, and I would give my avocados to the dinner, and that was my contribution. So I wasn't spending very much on food. I was eating a lot of olive oil, a lot of baguettes, a lot of cheese and avocado and cured meat. I would carry in my back pocket in the back of a cycling jersey. I would carry a big like a sub sandwich soaked in olive oil and cheese and tomatoes. I was living as high of a calorie diet as I could with as low cost as I could, which means buying 1 liter of amazing olive oil for $1, and there's a lot of calories in oil. So one of the last experiences I'll tell you about is a trip I took to Alhambra, which is a fortress, a palace in Granada, which is the next province over from Malaga. And the Alhambra is known as one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, the most beautiful locations. And it's on the side of a hill overlooking the city of Granada. And it's a mix between Spanish and Moorish architecture that was the fortress was, I think, traded back and forth over who controlled it for many centuries, and it's got a lot of the Moorish style architecture, and it's just fantastic to stroll through. There's reflecting ponds and orange groves and carved ceilings, and I think the most famous part of the Alhambra is the Palace of Lions and the Courtyard of Lions. So there's this lion fountain in the middle of this courtyard with all these amazing Moorish pillars, and it's just, the lighting is beautiful. It's kind of like being in a slot canyon in the southwest, but it's man-made architecture. Really amazing. If you ever get the chance to go there, if you're a fan of architecture, then this is a highlight. Likewise, I took a trip to Barcelona to visit my parents. They were in Switzerland. They came down to Barcelona, and I went up to Barcelona for a weekend with them. And architecturally is what I remember the most about Barcelona, in particular, Antonin Gaudi's architecture. His Cathedral de Sagrada Familia is this amazing blend of math and biology and religion. It's incredible, and it's still being built 100 years later, almost finished. And his Parkwell, I can't remember how to pronounce it, and some of the houses like Casa Batlló. Gaudi, who his last name became the root of the word Gaudi, his architecture is influenced by biology. It's probably one of the earliest known biomimicry architecture types, but just really beautiful, full of mosaics and swirling features, and it made me fall in love with the city, simply his architecture. But mostly what I remember about my time in Malaga was the endless hours of cycling and adventuring and exploring. And I believe I had an iPod. iPods had just come out a couple years before, but I didn't have a phone. I didn't have a laptop with me either. And most of the time the iPod was at home. And so I wasn't listening to music or to books or podcasts or anything. It was just me alone on the open road in the south of Spain. South of Spain. That's how we say it. I was just out exploring, and that has translated over the years of me living in all these places for a habit of just going out in the car, on the bike, on a motorbike, and exploring and talking to locals and asking them, where should I go? What should I see? What should I do? Who should I talk to? And just using the local knowledge to curate my own experience, even though I have all kinds of supplemental guides now on the internet, TripAdvisor and forums and Facebook friends all over the world that I can call on. I still like that old way of freestyle traveling where you just go to a place and you see what happens because you have no idea what to expect. And it was during this time in Spain where I got to know my local neighborhood merchants. I got to know the butcher at the market. I got to know the fishermen that I was buying fish to eat from, and just really getting the feel of the flow and the vibe and the pace of the neighborhood of El Palo. made me decide to start my quest to live for 3 months or more on every inhabited continent. And so far, I'm missing South America and Africa. If you've been listening to this show for a while, you probably know that I spent quite a lot of time in Southeast Asia. So I've lived in Asia, Australia, Europe a couple of times. So Africa and South America are next. But it started a quest to really immerse myself in cultures around the world, because it's far different to travel to a place and even spend some weeks there than it is to really live there and really experience a neighborhood. And even to have roommates is a cool thing, which I experienced there with all these random people, mostly from all over Europe, some Americans. So that's the story of the time that I moved to Malaga, Spain, to ride my bike hard all day in the hopes of becoming a pro cyclist. Hopefully you enjoyed story time because this is a new episode style. I've got a few more of these stories that I can tell. So let me know if you enjoyed this, if you've ever been to Malaga, if you shared some of these experiences. If you're a cyclist, definitely go to Malaga. It's amazing riding. Thinking about even having a cycling specific adventure quest there at some point in the future. So for you entrepreneurs that love cycling, come and join me at some point when I tell you to Malaga, to Andalucia. So that's all for today's episode. Now it's your turn to go out there and be adventurous.